If you look at any list of the greatest villains in television history, you'll find Joffrey Baratheon somewhere on there, probably in the top 10. That's because Joffrey is a great villain, one of the best villains in fantasy. He is cruel, sadistic, a psychopath with almost no redeemable qualities to him. While George R. Martin certainly loves great characters, Joffrey is perhaps an exception.
Joffrey is a classic bully in many ways, and he's very full of himself, and he's incredibly spoiled. I mean, he was raised without limits, and he's got two fathers, neither of which has ever really given him much of what you would call fatherly attention or discipline. I think in some senses, he's still trying to impress his fathers.
Are there reasons for why Joffrey became such a cruel and sadistic person? Are there perhaps some shades of grey to this character? We never read the story through Joffrey's POV, but there are still passages throughout the books that give us a glimpse into his character, his childhood and upbringing, his fears and desires, moments that give us some context as to why this kid is such a monster. For example, we read that Joffrey was a lonely kid with no friends of his own age, and that he was sheltered by his mother, CERSEI, and had an estranged relationship with his father, Robert. These moments provide some insight into how Joffrey became such a troubled, entitled, and cruel individual. While he is undoubtedly an evil and villainous character, a monstrous king that was perhaps beyond redemption, the real question is, why was Joffrey so cruel and sadistic in the first place? How did his circumstances shape him into the monster that he became? One thing that's clear from the books is that Joffrey certainly admired his father, Robert Baratheon, and that in a way, he yearned for his approval and to have a warm relationship with him, even though Robert didn't reciprocate this feeling at all. In fact, he disapproved of Joffrey and even had an apprehensive attitude towards him. In A Game of Thrones, Robert has a moment of vulnerability with his best friend, Ned Stark, in which he tells him that he realizes that he's not a good king, and that he sometimes wishes that he could run away to Essos, spending the rest of his days fighting with the sellsword companies of the free cities. The sellsword king, how the singers would love me. Do you know what stops me? The thought of Joffrey on the Iron Throne. My son. How could I have made a son like that, Ned? Robert always felt anxious around Joffrey because Joffrey was always a psychopathic kid, violent and sadistic even at a young age. But Joffrey was certainly a product of his environment, and perhaps his violence also came from the fact that he was trying to emulate Robert and the man that he was revered to be in songs and histories. Westeros is a brutal society where war and violence are seen as great feats that are glorified in songs and history. Robert himself was a great warrior in his youth, and Joffrey would have heard stories about how he fought during the rebellion, how his father earned the moniker of the Demon of the Trident. Robert won his throne with blood and steel, brutality and bloody violence. What happened to Rhaegar and Rhaegar's children is proof enough of how accepted brutality is in this world, because Robert was seemingly rewarded with a crown and a throne for this act, praised as a legendary warrior in the songs. The norms of the society and the reverence that his father, Robert, is given within it was certainly something that Joffrey picked up on as a kid. It's hard to not understand why he would grow up believing that such violence was okay and that brutality was the measure of a man by the standards of this world. Robert even shows disdain for Joffrey after he learns that Arya, a girl, beat him in a fight.
You let that little girl disarm you.
In the book, this moment is further punctuated by the fact that Renly laughs at Joffrey for losing this fight, ridiculing him for being beaten by a little girl, and Joffrey is genuinely embarrassed by this ridicule. It's almost as if he is embarrassed that he's not as good of a warrior as to be comparable to his father. In his mind, he probably thinks that that is why Robert disapproves of him so much, because he is not strong enough, because he is not violent enough. In A Clash of Kings, Stannis Baratheon recalls a time when Joffrey had tried to impress his father. He says, "Joffrey, I remember once, this kitchen cat. The cooks were wont to feed her scraps and fish heads. One told the boy that she had kittens in her belly, thinking he might want one. Joffrey opened up the poor thing with a dagger to see if it were true. When he found the kittens, he brought them to show his father. Robert hit the boy so hard I thought it killed him." This story actually says a lot about Joffrey and the type of kid that he was. Clearly, he believed that such violence and brutality was acceptable by the standards of his society, because he certainly expected no consequences for what he did to that poor cat. When he brought the bloody kittens to Robert, he presented them as a gesture of love to his father, thinking that he would approve of such an act, but instead, Robert was violent towards him. This was probably confusing to a young Joffrey who most certainly grew up in the society where violence was so acceptable, and yet to have his father, the great demon of the Trident, disapprove of it. On the one hand, Robert urges Joffrey to be a warrior that's strong and by implication more violent, and yet on the other, he beats him to a pulp when he does. Who knows how this mixed messaging might have influenced Joffrey's thoughts and behavior as he was growing up as a young prince. Perhaps things would have been different if Robert spent more time with Joffrey and taught him the difference between fighting as a warrior on the battlefield and simply being cruel and sadistic towards helpless cats or people. It's because of Robert's absent presence in his life that Joffrey never learned the difference from this man that he believed to be his father.
I should have spent more time with you. Shown you how to be a man.
This is perhaps what's led him to mistake cruelty for strength and savagery for manhood. In A Storm of Swords, we even learn that Joffrey is the one who sent the catspaw to kill Bran, and that he likely did it to appease his father, Robert. Just like the cat, he thought that he could present the assassination of Bran as a gesture of love to his father. In the book, I love how Jaime learns the truth of this, because he says, "There was a dagger. The scars on Lady Catelyn's hands were real enough. She showed them to me. Did you? Oh, don't be absurd." Cersei closed the window. "Yes, I hoped the boy would die. So did you. Even Robert thought that that would have been for the best. We kill our horses when they break a leg, and our dogs when they go blind, but we are too weak to give the same mercy to crippled children," he told me. He was blind himself at the time, from drink. Robert. Jaime had guarded the king long enough to know that Robert Baratheon said things in his cups that he would have denied angrily the next day. Were you alone when Robert said this? You don't think he said it to Ned Stark, I hope. Of course we were alone, us and the children. Perhaps Myrcella sent this man with the dagger. Do you think so? It was meant as mockery, but she'd cut right to the heart of it, Jaime saw at once. Not Myrcella, Joffrey. Cersei frowned. Joffrey had no love for Robb Stark, but the younger boy was nothing to him. He was only a child himself. Yes, a child hungry for a pat on the head from that sot you let him believe was his father. Notice Cersei's blindness to Joffrey's actions in the scene. That's the worst part about this whole thing. The fact that while Robert neglected Joffrey and didn't properly discipline him, his mother, Cersei, is insinuated to have encouraged it. In Game of Thrones, there was a small change that was made between the relationship between Cersei and Joffrey that is actually the opposite of what's insinuated in the books. On the show, Cersei is terrified of Joffrey, and his cruelty is something that takes her by surprise.
You never love anything in the world the way you love your first child. Doesn't matter what they do. And what he did, it shocked me. Do you think I'm easily shocked?
No.
The things he did shocked me.
This might be true for the Cersei that we see on the show, but in the books, Joffrey's cruelty comes as no surprise to Cersei. In fact, it's something that she herself has encouraged. Cersei was the only parent that really gave Joffrey any sort of affection or attention, but in the books, Cersei sees her children as an extension of herself. Unlike on the show, where she loves her children dearly and genuinely, in the books, Cersei sees her children as a part of herself. She therefore tries to mold them to be more like her. But the problem is that Cersei believes that being a strong ruler is being more like Tywin, being brutal, violent, and cold. Unlike Tywin, however, Cersei lacks patience and judgment. This is something that both of her brothers take note of about her. Jaime says, Cersei liked to think of herself as Lord Tywin with teats, but she was wrong. Their father had been as relentless and implacable as a glacier, where Cersei was all wildfire, especially when thwarted. She does not lack for wits, but she has no judgment and no patience. In A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion also takes note of Cersei's personality. He says, Cersei is as gentle as King Maegor, as selfless as Aegon the Unworthy, and as wise as Mad King Aerys. She never forgets a slight, real or imagined. She takes caution for cowardice and dissent for defiance. Cersei's idea of strength is being brutal and cold like Tywin, but she doesn't understand that Tywin was only that way when he needed to be. Tywin balanced his brutal nature with good judgment and diplomacy so as to forge strong alliances that could strengthen the power of his house. But Cersei sees diplomacy, kindness, and patience as signs of weakness. Only violence and fear is a show of strength to her. No doubt, this is how she raised Joffrey, especially knowing that he was the king's heir, and that one day he would ascend to the Iron Throne and be the king of the realm. Cersei no doubt encouraged Joffrey's cruelty because she saw it as a sign of strength, a sign for the strong and capable ruler that he could one day grow up to be. In A Clash of Kings, after he lets his Kingsguard beat Sansa, Joffrey himself says, "Fear is better than love," Mother says. Joffrey pointed at Sansa. "She fears me." This sentence alone proves that Joffrey's behavior was enabled by Cersei, and that she sees it as a sign of strength from him as a ruler. This is further cemented in A Feast for Crows when she reflects on Joffrey's leadership, genuinely viewing him as being a strong ruler for the kingdoms. It's particularly what frustrates her about Tommen's gentleness and so-called childish behavior. When Tommen weeps during his grandfather Tywin's funeral, Cersei tells him to do it in silence because a king does not weep like some squalling babe. In fact, many of times throughout that book, Cersei compares Tommen to Joffrey, and you can see her become more frustrated when Tommen doesn't appear to be as strong as Joffrey. Cersei even twists his ear when he doesn't behave more like his brother, indicating that she could be cruel and violent towards her children when they did not behave as she believed they should. Was she violent towards Joffrey when he was gentle and kind? Therefore, even though Robert's neglect certainly contributed towards Joffrey's psychopathy, I also think that Cersei's indoctrinations as a parent enabled Joffrey to be more vicious and cruel. I guess the last point I could make about Joffrey being so cruel and sadistic is that his behavior almost certainly comes out of a sense of entitlement that stems from his social position of being a prince in Westeros. Obviously, being the prince comes with certain privileges and powers that enable Joffrey to get away with the consequences of his behaviors. And even this can be something that's a direct result of the role that each of his parents played in his life. Robert being so absent and Cersei molding him to be more of a monster. As the prince of the realm, Joffrey was able to sometimes hurt people and get away with things without ever facing any consequences for his actions. A great example of this is in A Game of Thrones when he hurts the butcher's boy Micah and slits his cheek open with a sword. This leads to Arya attacking him in defense of the poor boy, which in itself leads to a fight between Arya and Joffrey. And this ultimately leads to Joffrey being injured and for a hearing to be held about why the prince was harmed. But instead of Joffrey facing the consequences of his actions, people twist the truth in his favor and he gets away with hurting the butcher's boy. Micah is even killed as a result of this, and Sansa's direwolf, Lady, has to be put down as well. Even worse is how this story is then framed to make Joffrey look like the innocent one, a victim who was attacked and had to defend himself against the wild wolf girl of the north.
You killed the beast. You only spared the girl because of the love your father bears her father.
I didn't.
When Aerys Targaryen sat on the Iron Throne, your father was a rebel and a traitor. Someday, you'll sit on the throne and the truth will be what you make it.
Even though this is an original scene invented by the show, I still think it captures the sort of upbringing that Joffrey had as a prince, a predicament where he could do whatever he wanted and faced no consequences. When he did something wrong or particularly sadistic, the truth could be twisted to make him look like the victim and the hero. No doubt, this led to a sense of entitlement and a superiority complex, attitudes that were made worse when he ascended the throne and became king. As the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, he could now bully people and be cruel without any checks and balances, and people would certainly cover for him in order to try and win his favor or place in his court. Certainly, this type of privilege and entitlement contributed towards shaping him into the cruel tyrant that he eventually became. So Joffrey is one of the worst characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, probably one of the worst characters in fantasy history, not because he's poorly written or cartoonishly villainous, but because he's so sadistic and yet also so fascinating. He might be a monster, but there were certainly factors that contributed towards it. His father's harsh neglect and his mother's tyrannical indoctrination, the brutal and violent culture that he exists in as a Westerosi, and even the sense of entitlement that he felt growing up as a privileged prince. Joffrey was certainly a kid with no limits or proper discipline, and this led to the vicious monster that he ended up becoming as a king. There is no doubt that he is a villainous and monstrous character, and that perhaps he is beyond even redemption, but at least we can understand the factors that led to his madness, and perhaps even come to empathize with the character as we understand his upbringing a little more. Or can we? What do you think? Let me know down below how you feel about Joffrey's character and the reasons you believe that he became such a vicious monster. If you like this video, then click the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content. Thank you for watching the video. Peace.